The Secretary of State calls ISIS attacks against Christians genocide, what today's declaration means. The fight over the Supreme Court turns to Capitol Hill, what senators tell us about the president's pick. Representatives are calling for Michigan governor's resignation as the head of the EPA is put on the hot seat, why they're facing blame for the Flint water crisis. And see how people celebrate St. Patrick's Day around the world. EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, March 17th, 2016. Good evening and happy St. Patrick's Day. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lauren Ashburn. The U.S. officially determines Christians and other religious minorities are victims of ISIS genocide. Catherine Szeltner reports on today's declaration from Secretary of State John Kerry. Catherine.
Lauren, it was a surprise announcement from Kerry. It comes one day after the State Department said Kerry would miss today's congressional deadline. But in a speech where he referenced ISIS as the derogatory term Daesh, Kerry was very clear. These terrorists are committing genocide.
That in my judgment, Daesh is responsible for genocide against groups in areas under its control, including Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims.
In his announcement today, Kerry describes how Middle Eastern Christians are persecuted.
And we know that Daesh has threatened Christians by saying it will, quote, conquer your Rome, break your crosses, and enslave your women. The fact is that Daesh kills Christians because they are Christians.
While today's genocide declaration doesn't force greater military action or ensure ISIS prosecution, those who pushed for today's announcement say it's a major victory.
We would like to thank Secretary Kerry for having the courage to make this decision.
The Knights of Columbus, with In Defense of Christians, published a nearly 300-page report laying out evidence of genocide. The Catholic group says the State Department was cooperative and wanted to do the right thing.
They've been willing to meet with us. They asked us for this report, and we said yes, we would do this. We sent a person to Iraq to do this work.
Today's announcement comes the same week the House unanimously votes to condemn ISIS atrocities as genocide, with a bill authored by Representative Jeff Fortenberry.
Clearly it had an impact, particularly the unanimous vote. This was bipartisan, transpartisan.
Fortenberry says the genocide declaration will have an immediate impact.
It raises international consciousness. It attacks the scandal of silence, as Pope Francis called it. It attacks the scandal of indifference.
This is the second time the U.S. has declared genocide in an ongoing conflict. It comes after the European Parliament, Pope Francis, and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom decried the atrocities as genocide. Lauren.
Kirsten Evans is Executive Director of In Defense of Christians. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And congratulations.
Thank you very much.
This report, as we just saw, contains some of the atrocities that were committed, 125 churches that were bombed, 1,100 people who were killed. You have the genocide designation.
Yes.
What does it mean for these people?
It's important, Lauren. It's important because by giving a designation, the United States has united our voice to the international consensus, which is growing and which is mounting. And it's important because as we move forward, both as an international community and in the United States, looking at our Middle East policy and how we're going to deal with the problem of ISIS both now and in the long term, these communities whose genocide have been recognized will not and cannot be forgotten.
The White House would say that these communities have not been forgotten. For example, at the White House today, they said they've taken steps to stop ISIS. They've put 10,000 airstrikes so far down, that they have pushed them back in both Iraq and in Syria. Your response to that?
Well, all of that's very true, right? And we're grateful for that effort. What we're hoping for with the genocide designation goes beyond just a question of military intervention. So with a genocide designation, what we're really looking for is being able to highlight the vulnerability of these communities as we look at questions such as refugee status and asylum, aid delivery. We know most of the Christians who live in the Middle East that are fleeing from ISIS don't live in UN camps, getting aid to those people who are displaced. We're looking for questions of long-term remembrance of their heritage, their cultural rights, their property rights, and ultimately it's a question of creating a safe space or a safe zone by which these communities will be able to maintain and thrive and live in the long term in their own homeland.
Is that even possible, though, without the destruction of ISIS?
Ultimately, is it possible without the destruction of ISIS? No, but there are incremental steps that we can be making. So by highlighting the extreme vulnerability and plight of these minority communities, their situation is put up in a priority as we begin to figure out how to problem solve in the region, and that is very, very important.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the work that both your group and the Knights of Columbus has done.
Thank you, Lauren.
Other stories we're covering in today's world. President Obama's Supreme Court pick visits 2 top Democrats today. The Capitol Hill visits come one day after the president announced Chief Judge Merrick Garland to fill Justice Antonin Scalia's vacancy. Jason Calvi is on Capitol Hill with the latest. Jason.
Lauren, it's considered a courtesy call, a chance for the judge to meet behind closed doors one-on-one with a senator. Now, Garland has been picked to weigh in on some of the most pressing cases in our country, and we were there as he was met with a hallway full of reporters and cameras. D.C. Chief Judge Merrick Garland meets Senator Patrick Leahy, the top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee. That committee is in charge of holding hearings on judicial picks. But Republicans have been firm. No votes, no hearings for any of Obama's Supreme Court picks. So I asked Democrats about that today.
They're doing their jobs by consenting to not having hearings, not having votes. What do you say?
The American people totally disagree with them.
I look at history, and in the last 100 years since we've had Judiciary Committee hearing, everyone, unless they've just gotten approved in 10
Senate
days,
Democrats gathered outside the Supreme Court today to urge Republicans to have a hearing and vote on the nominee. But Republican leadership, like leader Mitch McConnell, says no. So does the fresh off the campaign trail Senator Marco Rubio.
My position remains the same. I mean, I don't see the point of it. I know enough about his record to know I wouldn't support him, and I know enough about the position in general to say, number one, I don't think we should be moving forward on a nominee in the last year of this president's term. I would say that if it was a Republican president. And number two,
the White House says the Republican chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Chuck Grassley, will be meeting with the nominee at least after the Senate's 2-week recess. At least 5 other Republicans say they would meet with this nominee as well. Now, the senator of Arizona, Jeff Flake, says that if Hillary Clinton wins the White House in the fall, that the Senate should then at that point move forward with Garland's nomination. Lauren?
Jason, why is that?
The idea being that Secretary Clinton would likely nominate somebody even more liberal than Garland. But I should add that the Susan B. Anthony list said yesterday that they don't know this nominee, but they say whoever President Obama picks would likely support abortion.
Jason Calvi at the Capitol. Thank you, Jason. Genevieve Woods is a former RNC spokesperson. The White House says that it's not reasonable. It is not reasonable for Republicans to wait until the lame duck session because, quote, let's not let politics get in the way of doing our job. Let them get away with that. The Republicans making any sense here?
Right. Well, I don't know what could become more politicized than a Supreme Court nomination, no matter what year you have it, what month you have it. But to do it in an election year, a presidential election year, I think would politicize it beyond measure. And I agree with what Senator Marco Rubio just said. It doesn't matter if it's a Republican or Democrat. That's not what this is about. It's about saying we don't want something that's a lifetime appointment, so important to deciding what laws in this country, how they are interpreted and followed, to be politicized in terms of how we select them.
Now, you talked with Senator Grassley today, and it seems like Republicans are going to hold firm on this. Is that right?
That's right. I asked both Senator Grassley and Senator Orrin Hatch, both on the Judiciary Committee. I said, conservatives are concerned because now the president's made a nominee. Are you all going to stand firm and not even hold hearings? He said, we are not going to hold hearings. I said, what about these senators who said we're going to meet with them? He said, meeting is not that they can meet with them. He said, but we're not holding hearings.
Well, there are plenty of conservatives who say that Chief Judge Garland is fair and that he is a moderate. Ken Starr said he was supremely qualified. President Bush's Attorney General, Alberto Gonzalez, says that he deserves a vote. What do you say to those members in the Republican Party?
Well, from the get-go, this has not been about what kind of person would President Obama nominate. It's not about that. It's about the process itself and whether or not it should be happening in an election year. And look, even if they were to have hearings, he wouldn't be up there, whoever it is, until after May, after all the decisions have been heard. The first thing he would hear would be come next October, 1 month outside of a presidential election. There's not an emergency needed for a judge. We've operated plenty with 8 judges sitting on the court. I think he needs to hold.
Okay, Genevieve Woods, former RNC spokesperson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
3 Franciscan friars who let a suspected sexual predator hold a job have lost theirs. Prosecutors say in the 90s they allowed Brother Stephen Baker to work with children in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. After abuse allegations surfaced, the friars are now charged with child endangerment and criminal conspiracy. Baker committed suicide. The governor of Michigan admits he is ultimately responsible for the contaminated water crisis in the city of Flint. Rick Snyder testifies in Washington today, calling the crisis a failure of government at all levels. Wyatt Goolsby was on Capitol Hill today and joins us. Wyatt.
Lauren, Governor Snyder says point blank, we messed up in Michigan. He says the state government took too long to warn Flint residents that their water wasn't safe to drink and didn't take immediate action to fix the problem. Now some in Congress are calling for his resignation and even criminal charges.
Not a day or night goes by that this tragedy doesn't weigh on my mind. The questions I should have asked, the answers I should have demanded.
And I've had about enough of your false contrition and your phony apologies.
Governor Snyder is not the only one on the hot seat. House Republicans also blame Gina McCarthy, the head of the EPA.
Well, so you have to look at how the law works, and we did.
Yeah, you know what? And it failed. You failed.
Dozens of Flint residents came to D.C. by the busload. Peggy Brisbane Noblet is demanding justice. She reported numerous medical problems after drinking the contaminated water.
Nausea, vomiting, rashes. I was told that the water was safe for months. I mean, we live this every day.
Jackie Catron Leeper is a housekeeper in Flint. She is being treated for a skin condition.
I do a lot of washing my hands, but nothing like this. I've been there 20 years on my job, nothing like this.
The Flint residents we talked to agree all parties should be held responsible. Lauren.
Wyatt, thank you. Wyatt reporting from Capitol Hill. Secret meetings in Washington to try to stop GOP frontrunner Donald Trump. Conservatives are searching for a plan to keep him from the nomination. Some of them say they're not convinced Ted Cruz is the best alternative. Cruz did gain support today from former presidential candidate Lindsey Graham. And former presidential candidate Marco Rubio says he's not interested in being vice president. He says his days in office are numbered.
I'm not going to be vice president. I'm not running for governor of Florida. I'm going to finish out my term in the Senate over the next 10 months. We're going to work really hard here, and we have some things we want to achieve, and then I'll be a private citizen in January.
Rubio lost Tuesday's primary in his home state of Florida. In his concession speech, he said it just wasn't God's plan for him to be president. Coming up, dangerous waves of severe weather, how it's causing problems across the country. And the president outlines his new approach to Cuba, why critics say it's misguided. Pope Francis reminds us the world's problems have a human face. The Holy Father spoke today to the Harvard World Model United Nations. He reminded the audience of the Catholic Church's commitment to those most in need. Thank you for joining us on this St. Patrick's Day. I'm Lauren Ashburn. From flowing floods in the south to whipping winds in the north, severe weather sweeps across the country. High winds in the Windy City, high water in the Deep South, and Tornado Alley living up to its name. Brutal weather hitting a large swath of the U.S. this week. Persistent rains have drenched parts of the southeast for more than a week. In Louisiana, a grim illustration of the scope of the deluge. Officials working to recover dozens of floating caskets, unearthed when cemeteries became inundated. In neighboring Texas, residents living along the Sabine River ordered to evacuate as high water paralyzed parts of the state.
Families have been displaced, homes have been flooded, property destroyed.
The governor also leaving residents with a dire warning.
The rising waters are not over yet. The water could continue to rise for another day or two.
In the Midwest, the devastation wasn't from water, but wind, with powerful storms ripping through central Illinois, leaving damaged homes and downed trees in their wake.
We saw tin flying off the shed.
In Iowa, tornadoes, where residents clean up damage after twisters ravaged their communities.
I know I'm in my room staying there. I go through the wall, then after I get up, I hear my mom screaming my name, so I had to get her out of office, plywood and all sorts of other debris.
Heavy rain is helping ease California's drought. Reservoirs are starting to refill with water. It's good news for boaters and fishermen, but it's even better news for communities downstream that count on the water supply.
Good news is that the rains of the last several weeks have done a tremendous job at refilling some of the biggest reservoirs in California. The bad news is average isn't good enough. We've had 4 incredibly dry years.
Hydrologist Peter Glick says this year's rain isn't enough to end the drought. Water conservation is still needed. The Obama administration is making it easier for U.S. cruise ships, ferries, and cargo vessels to travel between the U.S. and Cuba. The announcement comes 3 days before President Obama heads to Cuba for the first presidential visit in generations. President Obama says he wants to change America's approach to Cuba because the old policy, quote, hasn't worked for 50 years.
We worked through what we thought would happen if we engaged with the Cuban government, and our conclusion is that it offered the best chance for prosperity, opportunity, positive change for the Cuban people.
Obama says it also sends a message that the United States is not trying to oppress smaller countries in the region. Mike Gonzalez is a senior fellow with the Heritage Foundation. Thank you for joining us, Mike.
Thank you.
Now, you were born in Cuba, you left at 12. I think you have some pretty thoughtful things to say about President Obama going to visit there. Is that a good idea?
Well, that statement that you just said itself, that he wants to show that America doesn't oppress small nations, that is just amazing. And this is the kind of language he will repeat in Cuba, which is really shameful.
Shameful? Why shameful?
The United States does not oppress countries. The Cuban government oppresses its own people. And the United States should stand for the freedom and democracy of the Cuban people, as it always has.
Well, what do you expect the president to accomplish here?
In the best of worlds, he would go and speak like Pope John Paul spoke in Poland and say, do not be afraid, galvanize the people who are afraid of their own government. Or like Reagan, when he said at the Brandenburg Gate, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall.
Is that going to happen?
No, that is not going to happen,
Okay.
Unfortunately. He's not going to say anything that is going to give the Cuban people hope for freedom or democracy. I'm very upset about this visit.
Cardinal Jaime Ortega is going to host the Obamas. He will stop at the cathedral that Pope John Paul was visiting. And do you think that this can lead to greater understanding with Catholics and Cubans and Americans?
There's been an awakening for the Catholic Church in Cuba since Pope John Paul visited in the 90s. I'm very happy about that as a practicing Catholic and as somebody born in Cuba. But alas, again, I'm going to be pessimistic. I don't think President Obama or Cardinal Ortega have shown a great deal of interest in the freedom of the Cuban people. So I do not expect a great deal from this meeting.
There are many atrocities that I have heard from dissidents. He says he's going to meet with dissidents. What do you think we'll hear?
He has said many things. He said several times, he said just 2 months ago that he would not go to Cuba unless there was an opening. Well, just last month we saw the detention of over 1,400 Cubans. We saw beatings. January was also a very rough month. There has been no opening whatsoever, and here we have him again, President Obama, going to Cuba on Holy Monday of all days.
Mike, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Up next, see some of the world wonders lit up in green, a tribute to St. Patrick's Day. And Father Vivian Boland tells us why this feast is so important. Pope Francis reminds us to rejoice in hope, calling it a strong virtue to help us overcome life's difficulties. The Pope delivered his message at this morning's Santa Marta Mass. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Lauren Ashburn. People around the world celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Bagpipers and high school bands led today's parade along Fifth Avenue in New York City. Blue skies for the nation's oldest and largest celebration of Irish heritage. It wasn't without controversy. Right to Life groups are upset that organizers allowed gay groups to participate in the St. Patrick's Day parade when some pro-life groups were turned away. And some pro-life leaders in New York encouraged Catholics to boycott the parade. Britain's Prince William handed out shamrocks to troops from the Irish Guards during the St. Patrick's Day celebration in London. In the past, the Duchess of Cambridge was the one who did that, but she stayed home this year with their children. Some of the world's most iconic landmarks are illuminated in green to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. The Great Wall of China, Rio de Janeiro's Christ the Redeemer statue, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and Dubai's Global Village all took on a new look today. Earlier this week, I spoke to the Prime Minister of Ireland. He says St. Patrick offers a humble example of following God. After Taoiseach Edna Kelly met with the president at the White House, I asked him to talk about St. Patrick's influence on Catholics.
Well, this is great. St. Patrick never wanted to be an iconic figure, but he did use a little three-leaf shamrock as a prop, if you like, to spell out what it was that he meant. And his message was about where the Irish can be in our faith and the principles that we stand up for of courage and truth and commitment to our common humanity.
We're joined by Father Vivian Boland, an Irish Dominican who lives in Rome. Have you had any green beer yet, Father?
I'm afraid I haven't found any green beer, no.
Well, tell us about St. Patrick. Tell us about the myth and the man.
St. Patrick was not an Irishman. St. Patrick was a Roman Briton who was kidnapped as a young man, spent some time in Ireland as a slave, was converted strongly to the faith at that time, returned to Britain, then to France, where he studied, became a priest, then a bishop, then returned to Ireland to preach the gospel.
Why do we have clovers and clover leaves associated with St. Patrick's Day?
It's part of the mythology that he used the shamrock rather than the clover, the shamrock, the three-leafed shamrock, as a way of talking about the Trinity. His spirituality and theology are very Trinitarian, even if the legend of the shamrock is not true.
One thing that is true is his spiritual stamina. The Pope said that we should also be consistent in our faith.
What we do have is a text from St. Patrick's hand, his confession, he calls it, which is in the first place a confession of God's grace in his life, in the second place an acknowledgement of his sins. And it gives us a picture of a very endearing, very simple, humble man who has suffered a lot, who has given himself to prayer, and who knows that any success he has achieved has been through the grace of God. That's his spiritual stamina.
Father, in America, people go to pubs and they wear green. How should we be celebrating?
I think through the layers of mythology, of celebration, people will find their way to his spirituality, to the things that are really deep in the life of St. Patrick. His understanding of freedom, for example, a man who was enslaved, who learned as a slave what true freedom meant, and then as a free man returned to serve the people who had enslaved him. I think there's an extraordinary understanding of freedom in the confession of St. Patrick, and that's something that we will always need to learn again.
Thank you very much for joining us, Father Vivian Boland from Rome.
Thank you. God bless, Lauren.
We leave you tonight with some Irish jigs for St. Paddy's Day. From the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Lauren Ashburn. Slán go fóill.